What is research on Dharma? By Venerable Rungruan Papatsaro, Dr. Rungruan Lim Chu Patapa. In Buddhist study, after making an insight observation on what really the mind is, then we still should not jump into the conclusion as to the Buddha's teaching immediately. Although the Buddha's teachings are the truths, but we have to go through an introspective learning process by performing research on Dharma stated in the 7 factors for an enlightenment, as he explained to the Venerable Sariputta as follows.
By having sufficiently performing of the 4 mindfulness foundations, then the 7 factors for enlightenment, namely, mindfulness, effort, rapture, tranquility, meditation, equanimity, and research on Dharma, will be achieved.
The 7 factors for enlightenment include the following components: mindfulness, effort, rapture, tranquility, meditation, equanimity, and research on Dharma. Typically, during performing an insight observation in the 4 mindfulness foundations, after having sufficient information and experiences on observed phenomena, then all of these data should be carefully investigated and analyzed to develop insight wisdom as a knowledge to be used in coping with the world correctly. Among all of these factors of the 7 factors for enlightenment, the first 6 factors, including mindfulness, effort, rapture, tranquility, meditation, equanimity, will be developed along the course of the Buddhist practice. That is, the mindfulness is developed during performing the mindfulness development, the meditation is developed during performing the mindfulness meditation, and both mindfulness and meditation have to be performed with effort. The rapture, tranquility, and equanimity are developed during performing the mindfulness absorption. And the research on Dharma will be developed after performing the 4 mindfulness foundations, of which we will discuss research on Dharma in details here in this chapter. The topic of research on Dharma, or the nature, is often overlooked by most Buddhist scholars who may not clearly understand or familiar with the science of Buddhism. The Buddhism as a pragmatic religion of searching for the truths of nature, it is necessity to observe, to investigate, and to analyze the nature, so-called the research on Dharma, to initiate a cognitive process of insight wisdom development. As a matter of fact, the Buddhism is a religion which is based on facts and science. Therefore, we need to conduct a sufficient research on the observed information of the nature during performing the Buddhist practice of insight observation to gain insight wisdom. That is, the research on Dharma is a methodology to analyze observed data in an insight observation in order to gain insight wisdom. In the 4 mindfulness foundations, the Buddha concluded an introspective learning from an insight that it is to understand the mind, to understand phenomena, then to understand the fetter that arises dependent on both, and then also to understand how the unarisen fetter arises, and how the arisen fetter is abandoned, and how the abandoned fetter does not arise again in the future. This is a Buddhist insight cognitive process which is a critical part of the brain development to gain insight wisdom. During the Buddha time of more than 2,600 years ago, at that time there was no science yet. Therefore, it was quite difficult to teach about performing a researching on nature, Dharma, to the public. The Buddha used the term research on Dharma after an insight observation in the 7 factors for enlightenment, because after performing an insight observation, we can be exposed with plenty of observed phenomena, and these phenomena need to be researched. Especially, performing the 4 Noble Truths, which is a main principle conducted in the research on Dharma. Typically, insight wisdom would not just come up as a result after performing the Buddhist practice, because the insight observation just a matter of gaining information from the observation, but it is a research on Dharma that yields a knowledge from observed information. Therefore it is necessary to conduct a research on Dharma, so that the mind will contemplate the reality of nature correctly. The research on Dharma is a methodology which yields a result of a contemplation on the Dharma. In Buddhism, a study by listening and being able to remember the words about the truths is one thing, but wisdom study by experiencing and cognizing the truths is another thing. conclusively knowing what the truths are necessary, but after performing an insight observation, the observed mental phenomena must be analyzed in research on Dharma, nature, to gain an insight knowledge so that the mind will develop kind of wisdom to be used in responding to the receiving stimuli from the world, and taking actions to the world rightly. In Buddhist practice, performing research on Dharma can be considered as a part of cognitive process in aligning to the study on wisdom of the threefold strategy. Therefore, performing research on Dharma, nature, is considered as a critical Buddhist study for enlightenment. On the night of the Buddha enlightenment, this part of research on Dharma, nature, was called the 12 realizations of the truths of life in 3 rounds, and later on the Buddha taught about the threefold study strategy. He suggested the research on Dharma, nature, in the last part of wisdom study in the Four Noble Truths, after performing the 4 mindfulness foundations by applying the principle of investigation in the Sutta of the 7 foundations, and the 3 aspects of considerations of investigations on arising phenomena, and the whole mind processing in insight observations. In Buddhist cognitive process, both an insight observation and research on Dharma are seamlessly coupled in such a way that whatever phenomenon happened instantly, the phenomenon will be reviewed and analyzed for research on Dharma. Therefore, in the Buddhist wisdom development, when performing the 4 mindfulness foundations, the 4 noble paths must be incorporated with the insight at all times. The word research on Dharma is composed of 2 parts, the Dharma and the research. The part Dharma here means the nature, therefore research on Dharma is to perform a research on nature to study on what the nature really is. And the part research means to make a comprehensive study including observation, investigation, and analysis to gain a clear knowledge of the truths of nature. In particularly, research on Dharma includes performing an insight observation, and then applying the 4 Noble Truths analysis on what is observed during the Buddhist practice to contemplate the truths of life within nature. The research on Dharma is considered as the study on wisdom, which is the third component of the threefold study strategy, that is, studying on the morality, studying on the mind, and studying on the wisdom. The story of Buddhism starts with searching for the truths of life within nature, then by performing the Buddhist practice, and then performing a research on Dharma to have an enlightenment on the truths of life and nature. The research on Dharma in Buddhism is a systematic approach of practicing to develop wisdom from insight observations of the 4 mindfulness foundations, then after having sufficient informative experiences, and then applying the 4 noble truths to perform an analysis on Dharma. That is, after performing an insight observation in the 4 mindfulness foundations, then we will attain a set of informative experiences, and these data must be investigated and analyzed properly by having a thoughtful contemplating with detailed study on the body, the feeling, and the mind part by part, then integrating in the Dharma, respectively. After contemplating on Dharma, then we can cognize for the right view of or cognition on what a reality and nature of life is, and this is an approach on how to perform a research on Dharma to gain insight wisdom of the truths of life within nature in Buddhism. And after then, we can apply this wisdom to liberate the mind by collapsing the process of dependent origination. This is a way to eliminate all arising defilements and suffers in life by wisdom in Buddhism. The Buddha explained that after performing the insight observations in the 4 mindfulness foundations on body, feeling, perception, and Dharma, then arising with the collective 7 enlightenment factors to gain the wisdom development for enlightenment. The 7 enlightenment factors consist of 7 factors including mindfulness, meditation, rapture, tranquility, equanimity, effort, and research on Dharma. During performing the Buddhist practice of insight observations, the mind is progressively developed into mindfulness, meditation, rapture, tranquility, equanimity, and effort along the course of the practice. And then after performing the observations of sorts of collecting all the factual data, then the Buddha reached a very crucial step of research on Dharma, nature, which was a very important step in the Buddhist wisdom development. The main reason why the 7 factors for enlightenment are after performing the insight observations in the 4 mindfulness foundations is simply because of the research on Dharma, which can be executed after having sufficient collective information from the insight observations. The word research on Dharma is a technical term that the Buddha used specifically when performing an insight observation in the Buddhist practice, but in general situation the Buddha would use the word yoniso manasikara, which meant careful attention, as follows. When having a consciousness, no matter what kinds of a mental phenomenon is arising, then having a mindfulness to consider it thoughtfully with systematic attention, yoniso manasikara, to determine whether it is wholesomeness or unwholesomeness. Yoniso manasikara, or careful attention, is a preliminary step of the research on Dharma. By having a mindfulness, we can realize whether the mind is wholesome or unwholesome. It is very useful in monitoring the condition of mind. During the course of practice, when performing an insight observation in the 4 mindfulness foundations, the Buddha suggested to perform a research on Dharma to make a comprehensive study on the mind by having an insight observation, then investigating and analyzing on the arising phenomena to activate the cognitive process of mind in wisdom development. The Buddha exemplified the application of research on Dharma on the arising feeling as follows.
While experiencing the painful feeling, he harbors aversion toward it and seeks delight in sensual pleasure. This is a wrong cognition without learning the origin and the passing away, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in case of these feelings other than sensual pleasure. If he feels a pleasant feeling, he feels it attached with ignorance. If he feels a painful feeling, he feels it attached with ignorance. If he feels a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, he feels it attached with ignorance. This is called an uninstructed cognition, by which a person is attached to birth, aging, and death, who is attached to sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair, by which a person is attached to suffering.
And by applying research on Dharma in the application of analytical thinking as follows.
Just as a man walking fast might consider, why am I walking fast? What if I walk slowly? And he would walk slowly. Then he might consider, why am I walking slowly? What if I stand? What if I sit? And he would sit. Then he might consider, why am I sitting? What if I lie down? And he would lie down. You are giving attention to some sign, and owing to that sign there arise in him evil, unwholesome thoughts connected with desire, hatred, and delusion. Then when he gives attention to some other sign connected with what is wholesome, any such evil, unwholesome thoughts are abandoned in him and subside, and with their abandoning his mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. When he examines the danger in those thoughts and does not give attention to them, his mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. When he gives attention to stilling the thought formation of those thoughts, his mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. When with his teeth clenched and his tongue presses against the roof of his mouth, he beats down, constrains, and crushes mind with mind, any such evil, unwholesome thoughts are abandoned in him and subside, and with their abandoning, his mind becomes steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. This one is then called a master of the courses of thought. We will think whatever thought he wishes to think, and he will not think any thought that he does not wish to think. He has severed craving, flung off the fetters, and with the complete penetration of conceit he has made an end of suffering.
In performing the research on Dharma, the principle of research on Dharma consists of 2 main components as follows. The principle of the middle way of living. In performing research on Dharma, the Buddha explained that there are 2 common mistakes that most people usually do in performing a practice. On one side is the mistake of enjoying the life with extreme pleasure, and on the other side is to torture the life with pain. These 2 extremists of pessimistic and pessimistic are delusion with useless. The Buddha suggested a principle of the middle way of natural living by balancing the living with nature. The Four Noble Truths strategy, that is, when experiencing with any phenomenon, then investigating if it is right or wrong, what is the cause of it? And in case if it is right, then how we can improve it? If it is wrong, then how we can resolve it? By performing this analysis, the mind will learn as a cognitive process of what a life really is. Then gaining insight, wisdom of knowing on the truths of life within nature, and later the mind will be able to use this knowledge in responding to the world rightly. During the early period of Buddhism, while the Buddhism was not quite well known to public, the research on Dharma, nature, was very important because it was the only way to prove that the Buddha's teachings were the truths of the Dharma or nature, not by believing in supernatural power. People became a Buddhist because they want to study in searching for the truths of life within nature. However, later when the Buddhism became very popular and then most people took the Buddha's words for granted, by turning the Buddha's teachings into a kind of having faith in the Buddha as a personal God, and mixing the Buddhism with supernatural stories instead, and then overlooking the subject of research on Dharma, nature. Therefore, in this study on the Buddhist science, we will focus on the original Buddha's teachings that are based on facts and science.